The Mafia boss paid $1.4 million for a monster horse, but the new nanny touched it once, and the beast bowed its head. Weston Hargrove had seen grown men break bones trying to control Midnight. No trainer could tame it. No weapon, no money, no threat worked. Then Holly Bennett walked into the ring, with a glass of warm milk in her hand, stepped past every warning, and did the impossible. But the moment the horse obeyed her, Weston realized something terrifying. His quiet nanny was hiding a past powerful enough to shake his entire empire. Tonight, you and I are going to examine a tragedy woven from raw power. The camera focuses on Weston Hargrove. He is 36, the ruthless architect of a criminal syndicate, a dark presence that freezes the blood of grown men from Boston to Atlantic City. Yet, on this freezing night, this untouchable figure is being violently dismantled by a $1.4 million black stallion. The beast is pure fury, snapping wood and kicking dirt, leaving Weston completely powerless. He cannot break this wild creature. It hands us a beautiful, harsh truth about our own lives. No matter how much money you hoard or fear you weaponize, there are natural forces in this world you simply cannot buy. Just as his bitter humiliation reaches its absolute peak, a quiet shadow steps into the yard. The camera shifts to 27-year-old Holly Bennett, the unexpected variable in this violent world. On paper, she is merely the quiet new nanny, hired to keep Weston's 6-year-old daughter hidden from the syndicate. She arrives in a faded gray sweater and scuffed boots, projecting total helplessness. But leaning into perceived weakness is often the most brilliant survival tactic when surrounded by predators. The armed guards yell for her to step back, but she freezes, locking her calm gaze with that furious stallion. The yard falls completely silent. Slowly, Holly sets her warm glass of milk on a wooden post and steps into the danger zone. It teaches us a necessary truth. The fragile surface image we project to the world is usually the greatest lie we ever tell. The ruler of this dark empire short-circuits. Weston stands rooted to the earth, failing to raise a single finger to stop her. Perhaps his soldiers never dare to act without his command, or maybe the horse freezes these instant. Her boot touches the dirt. Watching her move, something painful tears open in Weston's chest, pulling his mind violently back to the tragic night he met his late wife. By the time the supposedly fragile nanny eraser raises one hand and the killer stallion bows its massive head, Weston realizes the gravity of the situation. This woman is a deep wound wrapped in a careful disguise. It leaves us with a heavy realization about life. The quietest people in the room are often the ones carrying the most explosive secrets, and ignoring them is always a fatal mistake. A man defined by his need for control cannot allow an anomaly to walk away. Weston's calculating mind demands that he tear down her walls and extract the truth by any means necessary. Back in the dirt, the cinematic madness continues to unfold. That terrifying animal, a massive creature that just broke grown men in half, stands completely paralyzed under Holly's steady hand. The beast's erratic breathing downshifts into a calming rhythm. She holds her ground for 2 long beats, subduing the monster without speaking a single word. It offers a clear reflection on how we handle our own inner chaos. True power is never found in screaming louder than your demons. Real strength is the rare ability to stand quietly and remain grounded when everything around you descends into madness. The stallion releases a warm breath into the freezing air, offering a complete surrender. Most people would try to stroke the animal's mane or offer gentle whispers, but Holly refrains from that impulse. Instead, she pulls her hand back with the cold precision of someone who knows how to disappear. As she steps backward through the broken fence, her movements are flawless. Finn O'Donnell, a veteran enforcer, watching from the dark shadows, recognizes the body language immediately. That was not the clumsy retreat of a normal civilian. That was the undeniable muscle memory of a true survivor. It leaves us with a sobering thought. The trauma of our past leaves heavy fingerprints on everything we do, no matter how hard we try to wash them away. Holly turns away and walks back towards the stone mansion, her face betraying nothing. It is a true masterclass in emotional control. She carries herself as if she did not just subdue a lethal animal in front of armed killers. The guards are visibly shaken. Finn is wiping cold sweat from his brow, unsettled that his hardened worldview was dismantled by a woman in a wool sweater. Weston finally breaks from his paralysis, his predatory instincts locking right onto her. He stalks down the crunching gravel path, cornering her against the heavy iron gates. But the powerful boss does not yell or grab her. It reminds us of a vital lesson. Sometimes, maintaining a steady silence under immense pressure grants you infinitely more leverage than throwing a loud tantrum. Weston uses his imposing frame to block her only exit, casting a dark shadow over her shoulders. A normal person would crumble under that threat, but Holly simply holds her ground. She refuses to hand him the fear he expects. He leans in dangerously close, demanding to know where she learned to command an animal like that. Coming from a man who breaks bones for answers, this is a highly dangerous interrogation. Holly glances down at her milk, clinging to a survival rule her late father taught her. Never reveal your hand until you fully understand their motives. It is a vital piece of wisdom we should all carry in life. Keep your cards hidden until the time is right. She calmly meets his empty eyes and quietly replies that she learned it a long time ago. And her milk is getting cold. Without missing a beat, Holly brushes past his shoulder and disappears into the cold shadows of the mansion. Weston is left standing on the gravel like a discarded statue, his fists shoved deep into his pockets as he stares at the closed door. This man extracts absolute obedience from an entire city, yet this stranger just handed him total silence. The sharp crunch of boots breaks the quiet as his brother Tristan approaches. Tristan has dead, empty eyes, untouched by the freezing wind. He looks at Weston and calmly asks if they should run another background check, one that digs deep enough to hit the bone. It points to a harsh, undeniable reality in our world. The exact second you step outside of the neat box people put you in, they will immediately start digging into your past. To find out why, Tristan is fully prepared to tear apart every ranch in Montana and uproot every hospital record in Seattle just to find her real name. Weston lets the heavy silence stretch out. You and I both know how these ruthless men operate. They look at anything they cannot control and immediately perceive it as a deadly threat. Weston cannot erase the image of that beast bowing to her small frame. He recognizes the aura of a fellow survivor when he sees one. Finally, he orders his brother to dig into her past, but strictly insists the hunt remains in the shadows. He refuses to let her know she is being watched. The life lesson embedded here is chilling but true. The most dangerous threats in our lives are rarely the loud ones screaming in your face. They are the quiet ones, patiently watching you from the darkest corners of the room. A bitter wind sweeps through the gates, carrying the scent of crushed dirt and unspoken violence. For a man who rules through sheer dominance, an unpredictable woman with a blank stare is truly terrifying. She is not a target, and she is not a friend. Meanwhile, deep inside the cold walls of the mansion, Holly moves with quiet purpose. She navigates the east wing and gently pushes open the door to little Mary's bedroom. The 6-year-old is huddled on her mattress, gripping a worn, gray teddy bear, as if it is her only anchor in a house run by dangerous men. It serves as a heartbreaking reminder for us all. The youngest among us usually carry the heaviest emotional burdens, clinging tightly to the smallest objects just to feel a tiny shred of safety in a frightening world. The little girl is so hypervigilant that she does not flinch when the heavy wooden door groans open. Mary just continues to stare blankly out the frosted window at the black lake, completely detached from the nightmare around her. Holly quietly sets the warm milk down and takes a seat on the far edge of the mattress. Keeping a respectful distance, the camera lingers on this moment of emotional brilliance. Holly understands that when a person's spirit is shattered, forcing your way into their space will only cause more damage. You have to give them the air they need to breathe. She keeps her tone soft, simply letting Mary know she brought a story to read. She applies absolutely no pressure. It shows us exactly how genuine healing begins. It never starts with grand promises, but with quiet, steady patience. Under the dim light, Holly slowly opens a worn book about a little brown horse wandering alone through an empty field. It takes Mary a minute to process the gesture, her sad eyes drifting toward the cover. You and I can feel the crushing weight of a mother's absence in that hollow stare. Holly begins to read, keeping her steady voice grounded. She avoids the fake, high-pitched baby talk most adults use. Children living in a constant state of trauma can detect fake warmth from miles away. Her calm, authentic energy does the work, and Mary slowly inches forward until her tiny shoulder presses against Holly's arm. That little lost horse is exactly who Mary is right now. It proves a beautiful point about true human connection. Sometimes the best way to save someone is simply sitting quietly with them in the dark. Out of nowhere, the silence in the dimly lit room simply breaks. Little Mary tilts her chin up, her voice trembling into a barely audible whisper, asking if the black horse has a mother. Holly goes entirely rigid. That polished armor of the professional caregiver fractures. She is violently pulled back to the freezing Montana winters of her youth, choking on that exact same brand of grief. But watch how she swallows it down. She forces the bitter memory back into the shadows, turning to this fragile girl to offer a quiet, unbreakable promise that the mother is out there, waiting. Mary quiets down, her small fingers gently tracing the worn ear of her stuffed bear. It is a beautiful, tragic reality we all face. Shared pain creates the strongest armor, proving that two shattered souls can always become the exact shield the other needs to survive the night. Let us look at this scene together. Holly gently presses the heavy leather book closed, sliding it onto the nightstand, beside a glass of untouched milk. She understands you cannot force a breakthrough when a child is drowning in trauma. You and I both know the hardest lesson we ever learn is that genuine healing requires letting go of control instead of gripping it until our knuckles turn white. She drapes a thick woolen blanket over the girl and sinks into her armchair. Outside the frosted glass, a winter hawk circles the frozen lake. Inside, Holly begins to hum a haunting Montana folk song about rushing rivers. Right here, surrounded by cold men of violence, she is building a bulletproof emotional fortress for this kid. Pay close attention to the sound of this moment. Holly drops her voice into a low, steady hum that resonates in the floorboards. She is not just offering empty comfort. She is actively calming the shattered nervous system of this girl, creating a physical anchor in a room filled with ghosts. By the third verse, the gentle rhythm takes hold. The frantic breathing of the child finally slows, and her tiny hands release their grip on the plush bear. Holly finishes the final note and completely freezes. After 3 weeks of night terrors, Mary is finally asleep. Holly sits there like a statue, becoming the exact shield this child needs. The lesson here is quietly profound. True safety is rarely found in grand gestures. It is simply choosing to remain an unbroken presence in the dark. Out in the shadows of the corridor, Weston lingers like a restless ghost. He intended to keep walking, but the haunting sound of that lullaby stops him dead. We are looking at a father so buried beneath his violent trauma that he forgot what his daughter looks like when she sleeps. Look at his rigid posture by the doorframe. One hand stays hidden, while the other clenches tight, bracing for a brutal fight. Witnessing that wild horse submit earlier, combined with hearing his daughter breathe easy, shatters his hardened logic. Lacking the emotional vocabulary to handle this warmth, he slowly retreats into the dark. It reveals a harsh truth. You can never fix your broken life if you choose to hide in the cold shadows. Instead of bravely stepping through an open door, Weston melts into the hallway, masking the terror of a man afraid his mind is about to crack. The camera follows Holly as she slips into her bedroom. Pay close attention to the framing. Her window offers a direct, unavoidable line of sight straight to the stables. She missed this glaring detail when she arrived, a textbook example of psychological avoidance. She shuts her heavy wooden door and leaves the light switch untouched, letting total darkness swallow the room. Pulling a thick blanket over her shivering shoulders, she stares blindly into the freezing night. It is wild how painfully true this life lesson really is. We constantly complain about feeling trapped by our pasts, but more often than not, we are the ones who built the iron cage and locked it from the inside. Outside, the harsh amber glow of the stables bleeds onto the snow. Holly stands frozen at the glass, eyes locked on that black horse in the distance. Slowly, a trembling hand rises to her cheek. She scrubbed her skin, raw 3 times today, desperately trying to wash away the visceral memory of touching that animal. But you cannot scruff away psychological scars with hot water. Her brain still registers the phantom scent of horse sweat, damp straw, and worn leather. It is the lingering perfume of a tragedy she swore to bury forever. That mental fortress she spent 8 agonizing years constructing crumbles to ash in a single heartbeat. It teaches us a brutal reality. The past is never truly dead. It just sits quietly in the dark corners of our minds, waiting for the perfect trigger. The scene suddenly cuts backward in time. 7-year-old Holly stands in the dusty light of a Montana stable, reaching toward a massive mare. Her father hoists her up, guiding her tiny fingers to the warm neck of the beast. This is her tragic origin story. He murmurs with gruff affection, asking if she can hear the animal speaking. He explains that creatures talk through heavy breaths, tiny twitches, and shivering skin. Jesse is hardwiring his daughter's brain for radical empathy teaching her to absorb the weight of the world through her nervous system. But looking back, we can see the fatal flaw in this superpower. It reveals a heartbreaking truth. When you teach a child to physically feel the silent suffering of the world, they inevitably carry all that dark trauma as their own. For 12 years, Holly operated like a machine. By 16, she was calming aggressive beasts that grown men ran from. The auction circuits called her a horse whisperer, a title she despised. She was simply processing the physical data her father trained her to see. Then came a bitterly cold October afternoon when she was 19. They were working with a massive chestnut stallion. Her dad poured 3 exhausting months into breaking this animal, and they both made a fatal mistake. They genuinely believed the dangerous part was over. Holly leaned against the barn door, watching her father confidently step into the pen. It highlights a grim, unforgiving reality of life. The exact second you grow arrogant enough to assume you have tamed the unpredictable, everything violently falls apart. The lighting in the barn painted a picture of deceitful peace. Sunlight poured through the slats, casting a warm, falsely safe glow. The stallion was just standing there, playing the part of a relaxed animal. Holly vividly remembers smiling in that moment. Then, absolute chaos erupted. Out of thin air, the horse violently reared up. There were 0 warning signs, not a single muscle twitch that either of these lifelong experts could catch. That violent split second completely shattered Holly's worldview. It killed the naive belief that if you just pay close enough attention, you can predict what happens next. It took her 20 agonizing seconds to drop her bucket and sprint into the pen. But here is a terrifying truth about survival. When tragedy strikes, 20 seconds is an eternity. 32 years of her father's legendary experience ended in 20 horrific seconds. He bled out on the concrete floor he poured with his own hands. The vet had no explanation. 2 experts could not figure out what triggered the attack, chalking it up to a random psychotic break. But Holly swallowed a darker, toxic narrative. Her entire identity was built on flawless empathy and reading invisible signs. She felt her superpower failed her in the most crucial moment of her life. She remains convinced the horse gave a warning and she was just blind to it. This is exactly how survivor's guilt digs its claws in. It proves we will always choose to torture ourselves for failing to predict the future, rather than accepting the chilling reality that life is terrifyingly random. In the blur after the funeral, Holly hits the panic button, liquidating the family ranch in 6 frantic weeks. But the tragedy deepens. Her mother was secretly hiding a lung tumor, playing the tough guy to protect her late husband. What follows is a brutal, 6 years of sterile hospital rooms and zero money. Holly becomes the sole caregiver, sleeping in cheap plastic chairs to hold her dying mother's hand. When her mom passed 2 years ago, she left $180,000 in medical debt. Standing by the casket, Holly made a cold vow to grind away every penny. It is a classic coping mechanism. We often turn our unmanageable grief into a simple math problem. Paying off a financial debt feels so much easier to control than trying to mend a permanently broken heart. Holly's second promise was total avoidance. She swore never to touch another horse. She kept that psychological wall standing for 8 years, but that streak officially died tonight. Sitting in the freezing dark, she stares at her trembling fingers, hyper-aware her skin smells like the animal. The stable lights click off outside, leaving her frozen in pitch black. No crying, no sleeping, just a hollow stare aimed at the winter stars. Fast forward 3 days. The temperature drops violently, freezing the autumn leaves into dead brass. Inside the West Wing, Weston sits isolated in his dark walnut study. This oppressive room is the physical reflection of his broken mind. It proves a cold reality. The highest walls we build to protect ourselves always become our own prisons. The camera pushes in on Weston, silhouetted against the frosted glass of the garden window. The ice outside perfectly mirrors the hollow void expanding inside his chest. By 9 in the morning, his mind skips like a scratched vinyl record over cold coffee. The mahogany doors part. Tristan steps into the dim light, dropping a gray folder onto the desk with a dull thud. In their blood-soaked world, ink on paper means the secret is far too dangerous for any server. Tristan keeps his voice terrifyingly flat as he confirms the truth about Holly, urging his brother to read the tragedy backward. We often dig into the traumas of others to feel a fleeting sense of control, completely blind to the fact that weaponizing deeply buried pain is an absolute poison to our very soul. Today, you and I are going to unpack a story of quiet fractures. Watch how Tristan slides the dossier across the scarred wood. Weston does not utter a single word. He lets the suffocating silence stretch, reminding the room who truly holds power. Slowly, his fingers open the file, hunting for the exact frame where Holly Bennett shattered. The ink bleeds into Montana, 1998. A father who worked horses, a mother who taught school. Weston searches for the trauma that turned her heart to stone, but the pages reveal an ordinary childhood. The lesson here is a bitter truth. The most guarded souls never start out broken. They begin soft and deeply trusting, until this unforgiving world decides to leave its permanent mark upon their lives. The true tragedy bleeds through the black ink on page 6. Holly enters an animal science program in 2016, but within 2 short years, her universe violently collapses. Her father dies from massive head trauma. Weston actually stops reading. His fingers hover over the paper. Even a ruthless boss understands the paralyzing weight of sudden grief. The file then details her mother battling cancer for 6 agonizing years, drowning them in $180,000 of medical debt before passing in 2024. Holly was forced into the mud, working desperate jobs just to survive. The lesson is terrifyingly simple. One unfair tragedy can permanently rewrite your destiny overnight. This file is no longer a mere background check. It is the cold, clinical autopsy of a shattered human life. In this shadowy underworld, men like Weston survive by constantly seeking leverage. But the light shifts as he realizes Holly has 0 criminal record. No hidden vices, only crushing debt. He is staring at a woman who survived absolute hell without letting darkness corrupt her morality. It explains her worn-out boots and haunting silence, yet it does not explain her terrifying mastery over that wild horse. He flips to page 12, scanning the classified dirt his brother illegally pulled. By the 4th sentence, the blood completely drains from his face. He simply freezes in the cinematic frame. The life lesson here is vital. Never underestimate the quietest person in the room. Their perfect, unbothered stillness is very often the terrifying warning sign that your reality is about to be totally ripped to pieces. The truth buried on page 12 is a haunting ghost story. From 2013 to 2018, Holly was an absolute legend. Picture the veterans whispering her name in awe. By age 15, a Kentucky syndicate tried to buy her talent. By 17, she walked away from a $600,000 contract in Texas. She held the world in her hands. Then, her father died. The trauma struck with such force that she erased her own existence for 8 long years. The takeaway here is a heavy burden to carry. Deep, suffocating grief has the terrifying power to make you bury your greatest gifts in the cold dirt. The camera pushes in as Weston reads the clinical words twice, his eyes wide and unblinking, before closing the heavy folder. The silence in the office is deafening. Notice the way Weston lets his hand fall onto the folder. He is breathing like a wounded soldier who just realized the war followed him home. Across the room, Tristan stands absolutely frozen, witnessing a cinematic impossibility, a genuine crack in his brother cold Mafia exterior. When Weston finally speaks, his voice is terrifyingly flat. He orders a complete blackout. No one touches the girl. Surveillance ends today. Tristan gives a slow nod. Without missing a beat, Weston calls his head trainer, Finn. It is barely 10 in the morning, yet Weston offers zero mercy. He fires the man on the spot, demanding he clear out by noon. You and I should note the harsh reality here. In a world built entirely on dark power, the second you stop providing undeniable value, you are erased from the board. A suffocating silence pours through the phone. Finn understands the brutal mechanics of this underworld tragedy. He knows that fighting back right now would be a fatal error. Instead of defending his pride, he swallows his fear and quietly submits, wishing his boss good luck with that demonic horse. Just like that, a loyal soldier is thrown into the dark. Weston hangs up and locks the dossier deep inside his heavy oak desk, burying his new secret. Tristan remains glued to the floorboards. For the first time, he watches an unsettling shadow fall over his older brother's face. It is a psychological shift that promises nothing but absolute ruin. The truth we can draw from this is chilling. The most dangerous obsessions in a person's life never announce themselves loudly. They take root slowly, growing in complete and terrifying silence. Let the camera dissolve into the midnight hour. Outside the manor, the sky violently fractures. The wind howls like a wounded animal, driving freezing rain against the glass, like rapid gunfire. At 12:15, lightning obliterates an ancient oak tree, rattling the foundation, but the deafening thunder is not what pulls Holly from her sleep. It is an agonizing rhythm she has known since childhood. She hears the sickening thud of a terrified horse, smashing its skull against solid wood. She does not blink. She snaps from deep sleep straight into a cold, calculated survival mode. Out in the hallway, hardened guards are losing their minds in the panic. Here is a truth for your own path. In the darkest moments of total chaos, your soul will only awaken to the specific tragedies you were uniquely built to heal. Out in the heavy, cinematic darkness, the real test begins. Holly moves purely on raw instinct, her mind locking into a familiar rhythm of crisis. She pulls on faded denim and a thick sweater, ignoring the mirror. Rushing down the dimly lit hallway, she pauses for a second to ensure the young boy is safe from the storm. Down on the ground floor, she pounds her fist against the caretaker's door. Otis opens it, his eyes clouded with sleep. Holly offers zero apologies and no polite explanations. Her voice cuts through the roaring thunder like a steel blade, commanding the old man to guard the sleeping child. He sees the wild fire in her eyes and simply nods. There is a meaningful lesson here. When the world falls apart, true leaders never stand around, begging for permission. They step into the empty gap and take absolute control. Old Otis has survived 50 violent years inside this blood-soaked Mafia family. He knows the sound of true authority. He grabs his coat and takes the watch. The camera tracks Holly as she throws herself out the doors, stepping directly into the vicious teeth of the hurricane. She drags a thin raincoat over her shoulders. The quarantine pen sits only 50 yards across the flooded gravel, but under the heavy weight of adrenaline, Every step feels like wading through deep ocean water. Reaching the wooden enclosure, the scene is tragically comical. Half a dozen hardened mob enforcers are paralyzed in the thick mud, entirely too terrified to step inside the ring. This brings us to a very real truth. Heavy guns only create a fragile illusion of strength. Genuine courage means walking straight into the dark terror that makes everyone else freeze. Let the lens push through the wooden gate to examine this agonizing psychological break. The massive animal is backed into the darkest corner, trembling as a brutal thunderstorm wages war overhead. White foam drips from its mouth, and the timber behind it groans under the strain. With every violent flash of lightning, the horse uses its own skull as a weapon against the wall. Locked in a dark nightmare of self-destruction, Holly does not pause. She shoves a frozen mob enforcer aside. An armed guard screams over the punishing wind, warning her she is walking into her own grave. She simply tunes out the noise and pulls the iron latch. It shows us a simple truth. When a living soul is hurting itself in blind panic, logic is entirely useless. Only radical, fearless empathy can break the cycle of destruction. Stick with me, because you and I are about to watch a masterclass in healing a shattered mind. The camera holds steady. Holly does not rush the frantic animal. Slowly, she peels off her soaked rain jacket, folding it into the mud with quiet precision. She sinks into the filthy earth, making her body remarkably tucking her knees tight against her chest by the splintered wood. The massive stallion locks its wild eyes onto her frame. Its heavy chest heaves, but that sound of bones smashing against wood finally stops. Holly refuses to meet its panicked gaze, staring down at her empty, open hands. Her complete silence is a promise of safety. Here is a profound truth. When you face an explosive, terrified heart, you cannot fight the storm. The only way to help is to sit quietly in the dirt and become the grounded earth. The camera lingers on the muddy paddock, capturing the suffocating tension as it slowly evaporates into the freezing mist. 7 agonizing minutes pass. The massive beast finally shudders, a ragged exhale tearing through the silence as its ears relax. Holly remains motionless, her eyes locked onto the dark earth. When she speaks at the 10-minute mark, her voice is a haunting melody of childhood rain on tin roofs and the deep grief of a lost horse. There is zero panic in her tone, only the flat rhythm of a resting heart. By minute 16, the massive shadow surrenders, closing the distance. You and I can see the profound lesson unfolding right here. To calm a terrified soul, you must become an unmovable anchor. Offering your own broken pieces, without fear, is the only way to forge genuine trust. Picture the framing of this exact moment. A 600-kilogram monster is breathing heavy. Damp heat, right against her fragile neck, yet Holly refuses to flinch. She slowly tilts her head back against the splintered wood of the stall, exposing her throat and closing her eyes in a pure, terrifying display of peace. As the clock strikes 20 minutes, a miracle unfolds. The towering animal releases a massive breath and rests its scarred head on her small shoulder. Their breathing sinks into a single rhythm. Beyond the iron gates, Weston's hardened enforcers stand absolutely paralyzed. It serves as a beautiful reminder for us all. True power never comes from forcing another soul to bow. It comes from building a sanctuary so deeply safe that they willingly drop their heavy armor. Rain lashes violently against the sprawling estate, soaking the feared Don Weston down to the bone. Yet the crime lord stands frozen in the mud. This is a man who commands an empire of shadows with an iron fist, his mind a perpetual engine of calculation. But right now, the lens catches the blank shock in his dark eyes. His quiet, fractured Nanny is embracing a beast engineered for pure violence, and the animal is simply letting her hold it. Witnessing this raw, bleeding display of trust cracks the impenetrable fortress of his chest. It reveals a tragic irony that echoes through all of human history. The most guarded, untouchable figures are always the ones who collapse the hardest when they are finally forced to confront genuine, completely unprotected vulnerability. The cinematic lighting shifts to a bruised plum sky at 5:30 the morning after. Sleep was an impossible dream for Holly. Torquained. Her fragile nervous system still hums with the violent electricity of yesterday's survival. She drifts like a pale ghost into the cavernous expanse of the marble kitchen, desperate for the tactile ritual of brewing dark coffee. The massive mansion is entirely swallowed by darkness. For this one fleeting, beautiful beat, she is alone with her shattered memories, stealing a breath before the ruthless Mafia world wakes up. We are about to uncover a hard truth about carrying unresolved pain. When your internal world feels like an endless, bloody battlefield, absolute, crushing silence is often the only sanctuary your soul can actually tolerate. She is carefully measuring coffee grounds when the massive oak door groans open. The sharp, heavy thud of leather shoes echoes across the marble floor. Anyone else would have panicked, but Holly has spent a lifetime dancing on the razor's edge. Weston steps out from the pitch black like a looming phantom. His dark hair is slick with rain, and he deliberately leaves the lights entirely off. Notice the precise, agonizing distance he maintains. He stops exactly 3 paces away. It is close enough to let his terrifying aura suffocate the room, yet distant enough to keep her from fleeing. He simply watches the cheap kettle boil. In this heavy life, true authority does not require screaming. It is about knowing the exact place to stand so you can silently claim all the oxygen in the room. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? The psychological warfare unfolding in this dim kitchen is a masterclass in manipulation. Weston strikes first, zeroing in on her deep exhaustion. "You did not sleep," he murmurs, his voice a low rumble. Holly refuses to lift her gaze, volleying his cold observation back. "Neither did you." That is when the crime lord plays his hand, dropping a lucrative contract onto the cold marble. He attempts to bypass her free will, wrapping his dark obsession in the golden foil of a generous favor. He wants to trap her inside his inescapable labyrinth. Please keep this quiet truth in your pocket. Whenever someone tries to sever your safety net by dressing up total isolation as a rare opportunity, that is your definitive cue to walk away. He tosses a massive leather bag onto the stone counter, offering 5 times her normal wage. In his bloody empire, cash is simply a blunt weapon to purchase human loyalty. But watch how the camera frames Holly under the crushing weight of his influence. The cheap kettle clicks off. She pours the boiling water with an agonizing slowness, acting as if he just mentioned the weather. Leaning back, she crosses her arms and stares directly into the dead eyes of a killer. "I will work with the horse," she replies, her tone entirely devoid of fear. It is a stunning visual to witness. Money only holds leverage over your spirit if you surrender your inner worth to it. She looked at a dirty fortune that could buy a whole city block and quietly proved his currency meant absolutely nothing. This is the precise frame where the foundation of their dark dynamic shatters. She flatly rejects the mountain of cash, calmly stating she will collect her standard pay and heal the broken animal on her own terms. Weston is left completely adrift in the shadows. His tactical brain simply cannot process a reality where anyone denies his immense wealth. "Why?" he finally asks, his voice thick with uncharacteristic confusion. Holly delivers the fatal strike without a trace of malice. "I will do it for the horse, not for you." By refusing his blood money, she neutralizes the only weapon he has ever used to bind another human soul. Nobody survives telling this dangerous man no. It is a profound lesson for us all. Your most impenetrable armor is simply needing nothing from those who seek to own you. The untouchable patriarch is completely dismantled. He cannot unleash his rage because she has offered no angles to strike. She has built an invisible fortress of quiet dignity that his filthy money cannot penetrate. The heavy silence drags on before he forces out a rigid nod. "Fine," he concedes. But a bruised ego always bleeds out in a final act of manipulation. Halfway to the doorway, he pauses in the gloom. "You still have not told me the truth," he mutters, attempting to plant a heavy seed of guilt in her chest. Holly takes a slow, deliberate sip of her black coffee. "You still have not asked the right question," she whispers into the dark. It is a breathtaking climax of dialogue. "Remember this always. You do not owe anyone your painful history if they refuse to come with honest hands. The heavy oak door finally clicks shut, and the ruthless ruler of the underworld fades into the shadows. Only then does the camera catch Holly, letting out a violent, trembling breath. She had been holding it the entire time, standing firm against a monster who orchestrates murder for a living, drains the very marrow from your bones. As the tense days bleed together, she sinks into a quiet rhythm. Her mornings are spent shielding little Mary from the suffocating gloom of the estate, but her freezing afternoons belong entirely to the muddy stables. Stick with me, because there is deep wisdom here. True strength is never found in the total absence of fear. It is about feeling utterly terrified in your own skin, yet still stepping into the cold dirt to do exactly what you promised. Notice how the director frames her healing of this shattered creature. It is a poetic sequence. She strips away the Mafia language of iron chains and brutal dominance. Instead, she drags a wooden chair into the unforgiving dirt, offering nothing but bruised apples and her own unmoving presence. The second week, the massive beast finally lowers its head, allowing her to brush its ruined coat. Week 3 introduces the weight of a saddle, though her own unspoken trauma prevents her from riding. Then, she makes a beautiful pivot, leading a gentle pony named Biscuit into the pen. This visual poetry speaks to a universal truth about broken souls. You cannot force a shattered heart to trust you. Real loyalty is forged by sitting quietly in the mud until they believe they are safe. The camera slowly pans to little Mary by the iron fence, her tiny knuckles bone, white against the freezing metal. Raised inside the suffocating cage of a violent crime family, she has never known the pure warmth of an animal. With a silent nod from the looming boss, Holly gently lifts the terrified girl onto the golden pony. For one agonizing minute, Mary is paralyzed, her small spine rigid with the inherited terror of her dark bloodline. Then, the pony gives a soft, playful shake of its mane. Mary shatters the heavy silence with a brilliant burst of laughter, dropping the invisible armor she has worn since birth. You and I must carry this truth forward. The only way to conquer a paralyzing fear is to climb onto its back and realize the monster was never actually there. The camera lingers on the sunlit yard, where bright laughter drifts over the exact patch of gray gravel where little Mary's mother took her last breath. High above this heartbreaking contrast, hidden behind thick, smoked glass, Weston watches them. The untouchable king of the city's dark underbelly, a man totally numb to the blood on his hands, hears his child laugh and goes perfectly rigid. 3 years of cold, iron walls crumble to dust in his chest. He simply stands there, choking on the raw grief he buried deep in the dirt so long ago. 2 nights later, unable to outrun his ghosts, he steps from the shadows and summons the quiet Nanny to his table. Listen to what this shattered man shows us. You can build the thickest fortress of rage to shield a bleeding soul, but pure love will always find a tiny fracture in the stone. A man who controls the violent underworld does not politely invite staff to dinner. He issues a hard command for 8 o'clock sharp. Holly possesses no heavy silk or diamonds. She drifts down the grand staircase, wearing the exact same faded black dress she wore to bury her own mother, carrying her trauma like a rusted shield. But the second she steps into the cavernous dining room, the heavy power in the air shifts entirely. The merciless king of the shadows actually pushes back his chair and stands up. It is a staggering gesture of quiet reverence. They share a meal in a glass-like silence, sticking to safe whispers about the little girl and the horses. There is a raw truth buried in this heavy scene. Real respect is never something you can extract from people through pure terror. It is earned the moment you plant your feet and refuse to be a pawn in their dark game. Sit with this scene for a moment, you and I. Let the camera pan across this suffocating space. Weston leads Holly deep into his private sanctuary, where the roaring fireplace throws violent shadows across the mahogany walls. It is a calculated move, designed entirely to crack her nerve. He pours himself a heavy glass of dark whiskey, desperate for a fast escape, but Holly gives a slow, firm shake of her head. She sits perfectly motionless, completely sober, anchoring herself against the crushing silence. The only sound left is the sharp crackle of burning pine. Then, staring dead into the dying embers, Weston breathes out two heavy words: my wife. The truth of this heavy encounter is beautifully clear. If you want to survive a massive emotional storm, you must never let an intimidating shadow force you to abandon your own clear vision. Focus on the terrifying emptiness in his voice. It is the hollow, scraping sound of a man who has rehearsed his own damnation every midnight for 3 long years. He confesses, eyes blank, that his wife burned in a car meant for him, all because of a random schedule change. But Holly offers no cheap pity. Instead, she reaches into her own chest and pulls out her deepest trauma. She speaks of being 19, missing a frantic warning from a panicked horse, and watching her universe collapse. Weston sets his crystal glass on the table. The ice clinks like a judge's gavel as he stabs directly at her bleeding wound, noting she had 3 seconds to act. The brutal lesson here is carved into our deepest scars. We all drag heavy chains of guilt, but the second you hand someone the map to your broken past, they will use it to test exactly what your soul is made of. Watch the lighting shift as Weston leans forward, the dark shadows completely swallowing the sharp angles of his face. He finally admits the true, rotting depth of his guilt. He had 6 full hours to warn his wife about the rigged car, yet he chose a cowardly silence. Now the only sound in the mansion is the bitter wind throwing dead branches against the frosted glass. They sit feet apart, wandering miles away in their own separate rings of hell. Yet, inside that dark, agonizing space, a profound understanding quietly chains them together. His bruised ego prevents him from begging her to stay when she finally stands up. But look closely at his oak desk. For the very first time in 3 years, the terrifying boss leaves his whiskey entirely untouched. It proves a beautiful fact of life. No matter how thick the iron walls around your heart are, 1 second of honest connection can shatter your darkest habits. Let us turn the camera to a different kind of violence. Enter Audrey Prescott. She rolls up the sweeping driveway in a flawless white Mercedes, a machine funded entirely by cold syndicate blood money. As his ruthless lawyer for 5 years, and the woman sharing his bed for 2, she struts through the grand foyer like she personally owns the oxygen. She wears her blind ambition like heavy iron armor. A sharp trench coat, blood-red heels striking the marble, and every hair brutally forced into place. She marches past the armed guards, waving a fake folder about a meaningless buyout, but this is purely smoke and mirrors to hide a frantic insecurity. She is here for one reason alone: to mark her territory. Listen to the quiet wisdom in this frame. People will constantly build highly elaborate, professional lies to mask their true motives, especially when their insides are rotting with pure, unchecked jealousy. Weston allows her into the dim office at exactly 3 o'clock. For an agonizing hour, the massive room echoes with nothing but the sharp scratching of fountain pens. They sit at the desk like 2 cold machines chewing through dense legal documents. Audrey slowly slides the papers back, preparing her calculated strike. She has a toxic speech completely memorized, perfectly designed to manipulate his broken mind. But fate acts as a remarkably cruel director. Just as she opens her mouth, her sharp eyes dart toward the window. Out there, wandering slowly across the frosted grass, is the quiet Nanny, Holly. In a fraction of a heartbeat, Audrey's flawless corporate mask shatters. All her cold planning burns to ash. It proves a bitter reality we all face. You can spend endless nights scripting the perfect words to dominate a room, but life will always introduce an unpredictable ghost to ruin your grand plans. Picture this frame carefully. The lighting is cold as Holly walks past the dead garden in a worn blue flannel, completely oblivious to the poison inside. But the exact second her shadow sweeps across the glass, the crime boss stops breathing. It is a microscopic hesitation before he looks back at the contracts. But Audrey's predator eyes catch it. She recognizes that heavy, tragic gaze. 3 years ago, before the fire, he used to look at Audrey exactly like that. That silent realization guts her like a rusted blade. Yet, she glues her fake, polished smile right back together and sweetly asks for a warm cup of tea. 10 minutes later, Holly wanders directly into her trap downstairs. Remember this haunting truth. Genuine hatred does not kick your door down screaming. It sits politely on a velvet sofa, sipping warm tea, waiting for the perfect second to destroy you. Audrey leans forward, her tone dripping with a sickening, artificial sweetness, asking if Holly is the new nanny. The moment Holly offers a polite nod, Audrey unloads a full decade of pure venom. She claims she knows exactly which women Weston keeps close and which ones he throws away. Her cold eyes slowly drag over Holly's scuffed, worn boots before delivering the killing blow. She labels Holly as the completely disposable kind, masking the poison by sweetly telling her not to take it personally. The psychological violence in this room is suffocating, engineered entirely to make a grieving girl feel like absolute nothingness. The life lesson here is usually learned the hard way. The most destructive bullies almost never throw physical punches. Instead, they smile softly and wrap their most toxic, soul-crushing insults in perfectly polite, beautiful packages. Most people would shatter under that cruelty, but Holly carries a quiet winter storm in her veins. Watch her body language. Not a single muscle twitches. She does not spill a drop of tea from her cup. She simply absorbs the disrespect, looks dead into Audrey's eyes, and genuinely thanks her for the concern. She softly mentions that the little girl needs her milk, tells Audrey to drive safe, and turns her back. It is a breathtaking display of quiet dominance. Left alone in the massive room, Audrey looks utterly pathetic. Her grand design to watch the fragile nanny break down totally implodes, leaving her own massive ego bleeding on the floor. Humiliated, she fakes a phone call just to escape the house. Remember this golden rule. The best way to defeat someone trying to humiliate you is to hand them nothing. By maintaining your peace, you starve their toxic fire of its power. But the toxic venom in Audrey's blood runs deep. Instead of driving into the cold night, she slips down into the damp basement, where security monitors cast a sickly blue glow. The armed guards barely blink. As the syndicate's lawyer for 5 bloody years, she walks among the wolves like a familiar ghost. She locks herself inside the control room for 20 suffocating minutes. In that heavy darkness, her manicured fingers rewrite the master code, planting a fatal flaw inside the panic room system. She is building a quiet death trap inside the safest walls of the mansion. It is a chilling, tragic descent into madness. Let us face a terrifying reality about loyalty. The most dangerous betrayals never come from wild strangers trying to bash your front door down. They come from the smiling, trusted friends you handed a spare set of house keys to a very long time ago. Let us look at this dark puzzle, piece by piece, shall we? The camera follows as Audrey slithers away from the estate, parking at a desolate gas station under a dying yellow light. She pulls an untraceable phone from her coat and dials a professional ghost. 3 agonizing rings later, her voice cuts the static like crushed ice. Mr. Whitfield, it is time we talked. 9 cold sunsets pass before the torture begins. Holly is quietly sorting the mail when she spots a crisp, white envelope hiding between the standard bills. No postage stamp, just her name, written in a harsh, forced scrawl. It is a tiny detail, but enough to make the blood run freezing cold. The lesson here echoes through the darkest hallways of life. The blows that truly destroy your world are never thrown in a moment of sudden, fiery anger. They are plotted quietly in the shadows and delivered to your front door in absolute silence. The hallway is dead quiet, bathed in the sickly glow of a single lamp. Holly rips the envelope open, her fingers trembling against the stiff paper. One sentence bleeds onto the page. If she stays, someone dies, and it might be the little girl. The breath leaves Holly's lungs. Her knees buckle, but pure panic forces her upright. She scrambles to her bedroom, slamming the heavy door shut and twisting the brass lock. Falling onto the mattress, she hears the phantom sound of little Mary laughing. To know a sweet child is now a target in a ruthless cartel war crushes her completely. Here is a simple truth. A real monster never looks you in the eye to fight. They slip past your defenses in the dark, pointing their blade at the innocent people you cannot live without. Let us look at this together, shall we? The psychology of pure terror takes over the room. In Holly's racing mind, the massive manor and all of Weston's guards just fade to black. Her universe shrinks down to the tiny girl downstairs, totally unaware of the death sentence over her head. Holly knows if she hands this note to the Dawn, the gates will lock and the estate will drown in blood. She lost her father because she hesitated for 3 miserable seconds a lifetime ago. She refuses to watch history repeat itself. It shows us a heartbreaking reality about carrying grief. When the ghosts of old trauma finally catch up, our only instinct is to run. We foolishly believe disappearing into the night is the only way to shield our loved ones from the fire. Holly operates on raw, panicked instinct. She drags a battered canvas bag from under the bed, blindly shoving her life inside. Sweaters, cotton shirts, a faded dress, heavy boots. She whispers she is stopping a massacre, but the second her shaking fingers brush the soft fabric of the final shirt, the illusion shatters. Hot tears spill over her eyelashes, soaking the collar before she even realizes she is crying. She weeps without making a single sound, a tragic habit forged during those 6 agonizing years beside her dying mother. Defeated, she slumps against the bed frame in the dim light. We always expect true grief to shatter glass and scream. But the heaviest sorrow is completely silent. It is a terrible burden we try to hide away when no one else is looking. There is no warning knock. Little 6-year-old Mary simply stands in the doorway, tiny fingers clutching a folded paper crane. This child has developed a tragic radar for silent suffering, a painful skill practiced while watching her own mother slip into the dark. Holly freezes, entirely caught off guard. The little girl does not panic at the sight of tears. She steps inside the dim room and carefully clicks the heavy door shut. She walks closer but stops short. Measuring the heartbreaking distance, a traumatized kid learns to keep when the adult world shatters. We assume we are the ones shielding the youth, but the simple truth is that children map our emotional borders far better than we do. They stand patiently in the shadows, waiting for the perfect second to offer us grace. What happens next is a beautifully quiet miracle. The child lowers the blue paper crane to the floorboards, building a fragile bridge across the heavy silence. Holly stares at it, recognizing the cheap coloring book paper. Then, Mary looks right through every thick wall Holly has built. "Please do not go," she whispers, her voice cutting through the dark like glass. "Daddy needs you, and I need you too." Instantly, the fight drains out of Holly's tired bones. She reaches out, and the tiny girl rushes forward, throwing her arms around Holly's neck. They cling to each other, like drowning sailors. It teaches us a profound life lesson. We spend years building iron walls to survive the cold, but one honest plea from an innocent heart is enough to shatter that armor and give us a reason to stay. Look closely at how this broken woman pieces herself back together. Holly buries her face in the child's shoulder, letting that heartbeat calm the terror in her chest. She wipes her damp cheeks, and a cold fury hardens her eyes. Reaching into her pocket, she pulls out the extortion letter and rips the threat into tiny shreds. Mary watches without a word, understanding the heavy promise hanging in the air. Holly grips the pieces and whispers, "I am not going anywhere." She spends the rest of the night sitting perfectly still in an armchair, watching the shadows for monsters. It is a beautiful life lesson. True love will never completely erase your fear of the dark, but it will give you the absolute courage to plant your feet and fight, whatever comes crawling out of it. While Holly finds her footing, we cross into the suffocating world of Tristan. The man moves through the manor like a phantom. He already wired a hidden camera above the staff mailboxes, waiting for a slip. He was never watching Holly. He was hunting Audrey. He noticed her asking for a tea she never drank, her pale hands trembling, just enough to betray guilt. 40 minutes before the mail was checked, Tristan reviews the tapes and catches his prey. A rusted truck idling near the gates, a gloved hand sliding a dark envelope into the slot. It is a chilling sequence. Here is the hardest life lesson about loyalty. True betrayal never announces itself with loud footsteps. It always creeps in through the tiniest changes in the daily habits of the people closest to you. The drop on the glowing monitor is over in 4 flat seconds. The courier used black tape to hide his plates, but against a ghost like Tristan, that trick is useless. The exposed numbers trace back to a quiet shell company, painting a target on Brandon Whitfield. Tristan documents the threat the exact second Holly walks away. You have to respect that bone-chilling discipline. He does not yell. He does not pull his gun. He simply lets the tragedy unfold, carrying the evidence up the stairs to the dawn. Weston stares at the paper, his face turning to jagged stone, refusing to breathe a single word. It leaves us with a haunting life lesson. True, untouchable power never needs to raise its voice. It quietly gathers every single puzzle piece in the dark, before it finally decides to strike. Weston reads the ransom note twice in heavy silence. His features lock into an absolute void, empty of human warmth. Tristan stands in the shadows, not needing to speak. Audrey was the only outsider with access, meaning she sold their family to the wolves. Weston sets the paper on the mahogany desk. For one agonizing minute, the tension in that room could stunt a spine. When he finally speaks, his deep voice is hollow. He orders his enforcers to drag the messenger in alive, demanding complete silence around Holly and his daughter. No alarms. It is a brutal look into a dangerous mind. Here is a simple lesson about true resilience. When the hurricane hits, the protector never seeks comfort. He calmly locks the doors, shields the innocent, and steps into the dark to do what must be done. Stick with me, because this is where the story turns ice cold. Tristan drifts through the city like a phantom. By 10, they pull the trembling courier from a cheap motel. The kid crumples without throwing a punch, realizing too late he stepped into a graveyard. They drag him to a decaying warehouse on the edge of the estate. Around midnight, Weston makes the slow walk through the dense fog, wrapped in a heavy coat. Inside, Tristan waits in suffocating blackness. They have engineered a perfect psychological nightmare. It exposes a terrifying life lesson about human fragility. You rarely have to throw a punch to break a man. If you abandon someone in the dark, with pure anticipation, their own racing imagination will completely tear them apart long before you ever strike. A single, swinging yellow bulb flickers over the cracked concrete, leaving the courier drowning in shadows. They do not even bother to tie his hands. That is the cruelest trick of all, giving a prisoner the illusion of freedom to breed deeper despair. For 40 miserable minutes, the only sound is Weston's dead voice, asking 3 simple questions. Then comes the sickening crack of heavy wood against stone, and the quiet questions begin again. By 1 in the morning, the courier stumbles into the freezing night air. His bones are fine, but his soul is shattered. Weston walks back to the manor, brushing dust from his collar. It provides a chilling life lesson. The most dangerous people on earth will completely dismantle your existence without ever raising their voice above a whisper. Weston ignores the chill of his coat and strides into the dim study, claiming the leather chair where he once sat with Holly. He dials Audrey's number. Her voice trembles like a fragile leaf, but he offers zero comfort. He delivers an icy command to drive to the estate immediately. Pulling someone from bed in the dead of night is a brutal psychological chokehold. Audrey arrives near 3 in the morning, face smeared with tears from a terrifying drive through the fog. She steps into the room, and Weston just sits there. He does not pour a drink. He points to no chair. He lets the crushing weight of silence suffocate her. This teaches us a heavy life lesson about authority. True control is never found in the angry words you shout, but in the terrifying empty space you force someone else to fill. The camera pushes in on Audrey, frozen in the cavernous room. Tears cut through the shadows on her cheeks. She stammers, syllables tumbling, in a frantic defense. But Weston's absolute silence is a suffocating weight. When he finally speaks, his voice is a gravelly whisper. She has exactly 3 hours before his protection dissolves for good. Audrey collapses, her knees hitting the floor with a hollow thud. She weeps, swearing she still loves the narcissist who played her heart like an out-of-tune piano. Weston's face remains a stone mask. He turns his back, his heavy boots echoing, as he leaves her trembling alone in the dark. It is a haunting, irreversible picture. We must remember this tragedy. Pouring your unwavering loyalty into a poisoned soul is simply a slow, silent death sentence. Picture this haunting frame with me. It is 4 a.m. Audrey's car crunches down the gravel drive, headlights dead, fleeing into the blackness like hunted prey. High in the cold moonlight, Weston watches the faint glow of her taillights vanish. He turns, walking down the dark hall to knock twice on Holly's door. It opens to reveal her shadowed eyes and wrinkled clothes. Weston does to demand an explanation. His exhausted gaze simply drops to the packed canvas duffel resting by the bed. He looks back up, stating flatly that she was preparing to run. There is no rage, just a hollow, devastating observation of shattered trust. It forces us to face a tragic reality. The quiet, knowing stare of a broken heart always cuts far deeper than the sharpest blade ever could. His deep voice cracks through the heavy air, stripped of its iron command. He murmurs that she should have trusted him first. Holly remains frozen, her knuckles gripping the wood, robbed of speech. For an entire week, a suffocating silence blankets the estate. In this grim underworld, it is an acoustic shadow, the breathless pause before absolute violence. Brandon has vanished entirely. Audrey is a phantom. But Weston isn't sleeping. He pulls heavy hitters from Boston, turning his home into a fortress of pure paranoia. It forces us to acknowledge a bitter truth. A long stretch of dead quiet rarely means you have found lasting peace. Most of the time, it just means a devastating storm is gathering the strength to kick your front door in. Weston believed every crack in his armor was welded shut. Watch us closely as a master of the game loses everything by choosing blind loyalty over cold facts. A trusted soldier of 10 years calls, spinning a frantic tale of disaster at Charlestown Harbor. Weston hesitates, his gut twisting with a dark warning, but Tristan urges him to go. The camera follows Weston to his daughter's room. She is sketching a bright sun, tragically innocent of the blood staining his empire. He kisses her hair, promises to return, and walks past Holly into the freezing night. The steel jaws of the trap finally snap shut. It leaves us with a heartbreaking reality of the human condition. The most fatal knife in your back almost always belongs to the friend you have trusted the longest. In the dim hallway, Weston freezes. An aching urge to speak to Holly swells in his chest, but he buries the affection beneath a cold nod, driving off into the black night. 3 hours down Highway 90, the Boston contact texts Tristan. The enemy vanished, the meeting is off. When Tristan relays this, Weston goes dead silent for 3 agonizing seconds. The tragic realization hits him. It is a fatal setup. Tires screaming, he violently whips the car around the exit ramp, roaring for Tristan to lock Holly and the child in the bunker. Tristan sprints upstairs, forcing a terrifyingly false smile. This cinematic moment holds a truth that might save your life. Always trust that sudden, icy sickness in your gut when a dangerous situation resolves itself a little too easily. The camera frames Holly's face. She needs only 2 seconds looking at Tristan's bloodless expression before scooping up the sleeping child. They plunge into the freezing basement, breathing the damp scent of wet stone. Behind a false panel lies a massive steel vault. Tristan's trembling fingers punch the code. A harsh red error light blinks 3 times. Desperate, he slams his thumb onto the scanner, but the machine emits a dying beep and goes black. Their lifeline was severed from the inside. In that exact, suffocating second, a rifle blast shatters the quiet of the gates above. The slaughter has arrived. It is a tragic, inescapable irony of our existence. The towering walls we desperately build to keep the monsters out are usually the very walls that trap us inside with them. Tristan curses, shoving his panic down. He racks his weapon, ordering Holly to hide the girl immediately. He presses an iron key to the stables into her hand, then charges upstairs toward the deafening gunfight. Down in the suffocating shadows, Holly clutches little Mary. The child is wide awake, her eyes reflecting a tragic terror, yet she remains dead silent. She whispers softly, asking where they are going. Holly swallows a jagged lump of pure dread. She forces a perfectly calm tone, promising they are simply playing a special midnight game of hide-and-seek. It is a devastating reality of human survival. When absolute terror crashes down, we often must dress the nightmare up as a whimsical game, just to keep our fragile, breaking minds from shattering entirely. Holly clings fiercely to her fragile lie, setting the rules of survival. She whispers that Mary must not make a sound until a safe adult returns. The little girl nods, a tragic tiny soldier in a dark war zone. Holly lifts the child and slips into the freezing night. The icy air is torn by the crack of heavy gunfire near the gates. Holly ruthlessly buries her panic. She pauses at the door, counting to 5, tracking the harsh echoes to locate the shooters. Then, burying Mary's face into her shoulder, she bolts. She counts exactly 50 agonizing steps across the sharp gravel. This reveals a vital lesson about endurance. Focusing entirely on a cold, mechanical task is often the only mental shield that stops your mind from shutting down when your world collapses in flames. The camera follows Holly as she refuses to look back, blocking the nightmare from her mind. She slips into the damp stable, shoving the door shut. The air is thick with the anxious breathing of horses. A massive black stallion pins his ears back, but Holly ignores the beast, driven by raw survival instinct. She rushes to the feed room, facing a fortress of heavy oat bags. With trembling hands, she shoves 2 sacks apart, carving a dark cave just big enough for a child. She tucks Mary into the dusty shadow, grabbing her shoulders and staring intensely into her wide eyes. This moment reveals a beautiful truth. True bravery never means you feel an absence of fear. It means taking absolute control of your next move, even while your entire life burns to ashes around you. Holly becomes a firm psychological anchor in the dark. She places a stuffed bear into Mary S.'s hands as a physical tether, ordering her to count to 100 on a loop. The camera pushes in as Holly drills one unforgiving rule into her mind. Stay completely silent, no matter what sounds echo outside. Mary nods with chilling obedience, recognizing the deadly weight in Holly's stare. Holly presses a kiss to the girl's forehead, then steps backward. She slides the heavy iron latch closed, locking the child inside the shadows. Through the thick wood, a tiny trembling voice whispers, 1, 2, 3. It is a heart-wrenching truth of this world. Sometimes, you must forcefully lock the ones you love most in the cold, suffocating dark, just to ensure they survive to see the morning sun. The stable door is violently kicked open. A hitman steps from the fog, gripping a silenced pistol. Shrouded in a heavy coat, he sweeps the shadows with the precision of an apex predator before locking his eyes onto Holly. Holly stands exposed, inches from the vags hiding Mary. Fighting every natural urge, she refuses to cast a single glance toward the terrified child. Instead, she stares the killer down. She slowly backs away, methodically drawing his deathly focus across the barn toward the angry stallion's stall. The hitman stalks forward, never uttering a single syllable. This beat holds a lesson that will freeze the blood in your veins. A screaming enemy is frightening but absolute calculated. Silence is the most terrifying psychological weapon a person can ever wield. The assassin raises his gun, locked into the rhythm of a predator. Holly matches his advance, stepping backward, her gaze burning through him. She fights every urge to run, aware of the terrible truth. If her nerve breaks, he finds the child. She willingly becomes human bait. She retreats until her spine hits the freezing iron of Midnight's stall, feeling the massive stallion exhaling jagged breath down her neck. The beast crowds the bars, a furnace of lethal aggression. The killer stops, savoring his power. This reveals a profound truth about existence. We wear the polite masks of society, but beneath it all, we are simply animals fighting for breath. Sometimes, your only chance to survive the darkness is to fully surrender to the violent, untamed instincts of the natural world. The camera pushes in on the cold steel of the assassin's pistol. Holly has absolutely zero time left, but you and I are about to witness the brilliant desperation of a cornered soul. In a fractured whisper, she begs the massive beast behind her. With one violent motion, she rips the heavy iron latch back, throwing the stall door wide into the shadows. The cinematic frame shows thousands of raw, enraged muscle launches straight past her, crushing the intruder. He fires one useless, panicked shot into the dark. It is a stunning visual of pure survival. When the walls of your life are rapidly closing in, turning your terrifying environment into a weapon is your ultimate defense. True resourcefulness is often the only saving grace that keeps any of us out of an early, tragic grave. The single stray bullet violently splinters the heavy timber just inches from her face, scattering dust into the harsh moonlight. The killer never breathes another breath. The sickening, tragic thud of heavy hooves strikes the cold earth, breaking the man instantly as his weapon clatters away. The giant stallion stands over the ruined assassin, his massive chest heaving with primal anger. Then, the director slows the chaotic pace. The beautiful beast visibly forces his racing adrenaline to fade. The explosive violence evaporates into the freezing night air. Slowly, the magnificent animal turns his head, locking his dark, knowing eyes onto Holly in complete stillness. He recognized the true threat. Genuine loyalty is a primal, beautiful bond. When you offer your fragile trust to the wounded souls around you, they will gladly become your absolute shield. When the world turns completely dark, the dramatic tension lingers as Holly slides down the rough timber, her trembling legs turning to heavy stone in the shadows. Outside, the sharp, ominous crunch of boots on gravel sends a fresh wave of terror across her pale face. The barn door rips open. Tristan stands in the dim light, appearing as though he just crawled out of a violent trench, a dark streak of blood painting his cheek. His eyes sweep over the lifeless body and the terrified woman. Lowering his weapon, his posture softens into a beautifully tragic calm. He gently asks if she is injured. She manages a single, fragile nod, whispering that the little girl remains safely locked away. It brings us to a quiet, heartbreaking truth. A true protector will gladly shoulder the heaviest burdens. It's just real. Strength means holding your own shattered pieces together for someone who desperately needs your light. Notice the chilling shift in Tristan's body language that perfectly flips the mental switch, instantly becoming the untouchable Mafia enforcer. 2 brief phone calls are made in the cold darkness. Minutes later, a silent crew slips through the cinematic fog, dragging the ruined attacker away like discarded trash. But then, the emotional lighting warms entirely. Tristan drops into a low crouch by the feed room, pushing the door open just a fraction of an inch. His voice transforms into a wonderfully tender, paternal whisper. He asks the innocent child if she is still counting her numbers, praising her softly as she remains blissfully unaware of the bloody horror outside. It highlights a beautifully painful reality. Sometimes, managing a devastating crisis means swallowing your darkest secrets. Shielding an innocent mind is always worth burying the absolute, ugliest parts of humanity. Stick with me, because this is the exact moment the entire tragic narrative shifts. Weston, the untouchable crime boss, appears in the doorway looking like a completely shattered ghost. His expensive coat hangs loosely off his broad shoulders, dusted with the ashes of their chaos. He surveys the devastated, bullet-scared barn, his eyes locking onto Holly, shivering against the wall. Completely ignoring his heavily armed guards, he walks straight toward her. For the very first time, he reaches out and pulls her into a desperately deep embrace. This is an aching grab for a human anchor in a collapsing world. It beautifully reveals how life truly operates when the floor drops out. When a terrifying tragedy strikes, all our fake social hierarchies instantly burn away to nothing. Extreme trauma strips us down to the bone, leaving only the raw connection we so desperately crave. The camera lingers on their fragile embrace as Weston pulls her tight against his chest, projecting a dizzying aura of absolute safety. His hands grip her shoulders with tragic desperation, locking her inside his dark world. But the audience sees the heartbreaking truth. The untouchable king is physically trembling in the cold moonlight. This is exactly how inescapable, deeply romantic trauma bonds are forged in the dead of night. Too utterly exhausted to fight the rising tide, she rests her head against his racing heart, whispering that his beautiful child is safe. By morning, his criminal empire looks completely flawless, the bullet holes magically erased from existence. It leaves us with a heavy, poetic realization. The illusion of a perfectly safe life is the most dangerous trap. Powerful people will build a quiet paradise just to keep you locked inside their golden cage forever. Let us pause the cinematic reel and look at this moment together. What does it truly mean when a horrifically violent crime scene simply evaporates before dawn? The shattered wood is seamlessly repaired. The dark, tragic bloodstains are meticulously washed away long before the morning light touches the earth. The fallen assassin is dragged into the shadows by a crew of absolute ghosts. Erasing a human life as if it never existed is a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It is the chilling, silent way these broken men maintain their suffocating grip on the trembling city. This leaves us with a terrifying insight into the mechanics of pure influence. Ultimate power is not about surviving a lethal ambush in the dark. True power is possessing the endless wealth to flawlessly convince the entire waking world that your bloody nightmare never actually happened. The soft golden morning light slowly bleeds through the heavy velvet curtains, casting a tragic warmth over the kitchen. Little Mary sits cheerfully at the Grand Island, happily eating her breakfast. Tristan had silently slipped her into bed hours ago, and now she chatters away about a vivid, beautiful dream filled with massive black horses. Weston enters the frame, gently kissing the top of her head. But here is the subtle, heartbreaking detail the director wants you to see. The innocent child completely ignores the fresh, jagged cut weeping across her father's hand. In these shadowy, doomed families, children learn incredibly early to turn a blind eye to the brutality. The lesson here is a bitter, tear-jerking pill. We will desperately bury the ugliest, bloodiest truths in the darkest corners of our minds, just to buy ourselves one single, fleeting day of peace. The scene cuts back to the quiet, dusty shadows of the stables. Holly remains slumped against the wooden beams, a thin, tragic bandage resting on her pale brow. The magnificent black horse stands closely over her, as they both slowly breathe through the lingering panic in their veins. The heavy door creaks softly, and Weston steps inside the frame. He has scrubbed the violence from his skin. Notice his slow, delicate body language. He offers her a warm cup of coffee, keeping a respectful distance, yet remaining close enough to be her emotional anchor. Then, right there in the cinematic silence, his impenetrable armor shatters into a million pieces. He looks deep into her exhausted eyes and confesses that his late wife was named Clara. The poetic truth is undeniable. Sometimes, surviving a deeply shared nightmare is the only grace powerful enough to melt a frozen heart. You and I both know exactly how rare it is for a fiercely ruthless man to pull back the heavy theatrical curtain like this. Every ounce of his cold, calculating mafia logic completely abandons his trembling voice. He stares down into the dark reflection of his coffee and bleeds out the haunting ghost of his past. He was only 27 when he married Clara, a brilliantly vibrant architect. The sheer agony is painfully visible as he recounts his one fatal, catastrophic mistake. He sent her to that warehouse in his place, fully knowing his own vehicle was marked for death by rival factions. He makes absolutely zero pathetic excuses. He carries the crushing, inescapable weight of her brutal murder squarely upon his own broad shoulders. It is a heartbreaking reminder. You can build an absolute empire, but no amount of dirty wealth can ever buy back your tragically lost soul. The tragic monologue reaches its absolute peak. He openly confesses that 40 loose minutes were all it took to burn his entire, beautiful life to ashes. Holly remains perfectly still, keeping her hand resting on the massive horse to stay tethered to reality. The lighting dims as Weston reveals his most dangerously romantic secret. For 3 agonizing years, he locked his own bleeding soul inside an emotional cage, deliberately pushing everyone away so his enemies had nothing left to destroy. Letting his coffee grow cold, he drops the final stunning revelation. He is secretly tearing down his own bloody syndicate from the inside out to save his daughter. Tristan handles the brutal fallout while he washes the money clean. The final lesson shines brilliantly through the darkness. True, aching regret and a fierce fatherly love can push any condemned man to rewrite his destiny. The camera pushes in on a dim room where the silence feels heavy enough to break bones. Weston holds her gaze, asking the agonizing question that will fracture their universe. Will she stay to watch him step into the light? You and I both know this is not some broken captive falling for a jailer. Holly sets her cup on the table with a soft clink. Her fingers tremble slightly, yet she hides no fear. She holds his stare, offering one slow, deliberate nod. A terrifying choice made in absolute freedom. Weston turns his scarred hand over, lacing his grip fiercely through hers. The lesson is written right there in their trembling grasp. When the world offers nothing but brutal chaos, anchoring your soul to another human being becomes the ultimate magnificent act of rebellion. 6 agonizing months bleed away, fading into cold cinematic tones. The underworld they knew is utterly gutted. Brandon Whitfield, the arrogant rival who ordered the hit, flinches as federal agents kick his doors off their hinges. Notice the beautifully tragic irony here. Brandon is not left choking on his blood in a rain-slicked alley. Instead, he is suffocated by 400 pages of wiretaps and financial ruin, delivered by a ghost. Weston erased his existence from those files entirely, destroying his greatest enemy without ever drawing a weapon. The life lesson hidden in this slow-burn revenge is absolute. The most lethal destruction never comes from a fired bullet. True strength is terrifyingly patient, wrapped flawlessly within the iron grip of a legal contract. It is a rare sight to watch a king willingly burn down the fortress that kept him breathing. You and I both know what terrifying love can do to a fractured soul. The syndicate begins its agonizing death right there in the dirt. Weston hands the crown to Tristan, not to rule the shadows, but to systematically pull the plug. It is a masterpiece of a demolition. No fresh blood spilled, no ruthless expansion, just a hushed end to the violence. While the paranoid streets whisper, Weston bleeds his millions into pure ventures, desperate to scrub the red stains from his ledger, and the camera finally finds Holly. The trembling girl who arrived as a captive is dead. She stands tall in the falling ash, a quiet queen finally dictating the terms of her own beautiful destiny. The harsh winter frost surrenders to spring, shifting the cinematic palette to a warm gold. Holly steps directly into the sun, launching an equine sanctuary for broken kids to resurrect her father's fading legacy. Weston funds every dime from the shadows, ensuring his violent ghosts never cross her property line. Midnight, the massive black warhorse breathes heavily in his stall like a mythological guardian. For tiny Mary, that beast is her only true confessor. She leans against the fence every afternoon, pouring her secrets into his thick mane. The peace breaks on an unnervingly warm April afternoon. The barn doors violently burst open. Mary comes sprinting across the bright grass, clutching a crumpled scrap of paper against her chest, as if the entire world might end if she lets it go. I need you to pause and feel the agonizing weight of this single frame with me. Weston and Holly stand in the golden yard as Mary collides with them. The child shoves a wrinkled paper against her father's rigid chest. The camera pans down to a rough crayon drawing. A man, a woman, a tiny girl, and a towering black horse. Above them, written in sloppy letters, read the words "my family." The beautiful lesson is that an innocent child declared them whole long before the broken adults dared to whisper it. Weston stops breathing. We watch his jaw tremble as the crushing reality of grace shatters his iron armor into dust. His scarred fingers slowly fold the paper, pressing it deep into his chest pocket over his racing heart. He lifts his tortured eyes to meet Holly's, And the heavy silence says absolutely everything. The child sprints back into the sun, oblivious to the emotional walls she just tore down. A suffocating silence swallows the yard. Weston leans in, his voice cracking into a desperate whisper as he asks, "Will you stay?" 6 months ago, this merciless kingpin was bleeding on the floor, begging fate for a few more hours. Now he rips his chest open to ask this woman for eternity. Holly doesn't give a passive nod. The lens traces her eyes as she absorbs the laughing child, and the fragile peace they bled for. She locks onto his desperate stare. "I did not come here to fit in," she murmurs. "I came here to belong." She steps out of the lingering shadows to claim her crown. He extends his scarred hand, and she fiercely anchors herself to him. The violent nightmare is finally over. The lens captures the swirling dust of an ordinary afternoon, but the miracle playing out is profound. A brutal former kingpin, a traumatized survivor, an innocent girl, and a battered horse have rewired their shattered hearts to find peace. The heavy life lesson here is absolute. We are never defined by our darkest mistakes, or the rusted armor we strap on to survive the night. Visceral healing begins when someone stares directly at your terrifying history and deliberately chooses to stay. Those agonizing wounds do not close just because time passes. They heal because someone finally sits in the pitch-black dirt with you and listens, without trying to control you. Real loyalty is never bound by blood oaths or gang codes. It lives entirely in a messy crayon drawing, and two scarred hands clutching each other as the sun finally sets. The heavy curtain falls on one of the most beautifully tragic stories we have explored on this channel. If watching this ruthless boss willingly burn down, his empire struck a chord deep within your chest, leave a like so I know you are listening out there in the cold dark. Share this film with someone who needs proof that redemption is real, and subscribe to keep our midnight broadcast alive. Now, I need you and I to have a brutally honest conversation. How do you process Holly transforming from a trembling captive into the fierce architect of her own destiny? Did you recognize your own exhausted survival instincts bleeding through her character? Maybe you are exactly like her, waking up convinced you must carry the crushing weight of the universe on your bruised shoulders, with absolutely no one to help you hold up the sky. Or perhaps Weston holds the dark, cracked mirror up to your own soul. His chilling detachment is a familiar ghost. We have all felt that suffocating urge to lock ourselves inside a fortress to guarantee we never bleed again. We stack massive emotional bricks desperately at convincing ourselves provides safety. The tragic lesson is that those barricades are nothing but the walls of our own solitary confinement. Maybe you know a hardened soul whose quiet distance you misread as bitter anger, when in truth they were barely surviving the hour. Tell me where you stand in the comments below. Take a long look at the rusted barricades you are still violently defending in your own life, and ask yourself if it is finally time to let them crumble. Keep your eyes wide open in the shadows out there. I will be waiting for you in our next late-night broadcast.
The final lesson from the story is that personal's most healing, most powerful when it grows into service. Holly does not simply recover her gift with horses and keep it for herself. After surviving grief, guilt, medical debt, for fear and danger, she helps create the Bennett Horse Program for orphan children from care centers. This is deeply meaningful because the program honors her father while then transforming her pain into something useful for others. The Black Stallion Midnight, once feared as dangerous and impossible to control, becomes part of a place where wounded children can learn trust. Mary, once silent and grieving, begins to see the stable as part of her family. Weston, once trapped in a violent legacy, starts changing Hargrove Capital into something his daughter can inherit without inheriting darkness. This teaches an inspiring educational lesson. Healing is not only about feeling better, it is also about building something better from what hurt us. Holly could have let her father's death define horses forever as symbols of guilt. Instead, she eventually allows horses to become instruments of connection, courage, and therapy. Weston could have remained a man ruled by fear and criminal inheritance. Instead, he begins reshaping his power into responsibility. The transformation shows that people are not doomed to repeat the pain they received. They can choose to turn memory into meaning. For viewers, this lesson is hopeful and practical. Whatever pain we carry, we can ask, how can this experience help me become more compassionate, more responsible, or more useful to others? Holly's story reminds us that the strongest people are not those who were never broken. They are the ones who learn to make a safe place for others from the very ground where they once fell.